and you've got reasonable audio. Hope everything's okay. So welcome to this meeting. My name's Carlo Morelli. I'm the UCU Scotland president, and this is a Fringe meeting organised by UCU on trade unions, COP26 and the climate change emergency. So hopefully we've got UCU members here and delegates to the STUC and other trade union activists. Hopefully that's the audience we're looking at. I'm joined by a number of people that are going to contribute for 5 minutes, and then we'll open up to a general discussion. It's not a formal Q&A, it's more a panel discussion, really, hopefully we'll have. And so before I start, let me welcome Rebecca, who's doing our sign language for us. So thanks very much, Rebecca. It's very kind of you. And I've asked all the speakers to make sure they take a breath between sentences to give Rebecca a moment or two to be able to catch up. Okay, so let me introduce everybody. We've got Vicky Blake, who's the UCU president. She'll speak first, and then be followed by Lena Rangren, who's currently UCU vice president, but will become UCU president from May onwards, in UCU Scotland president, I should say, from May onwards. And then we've got Eirik Skandrick, who's a UCU member at Queen Margaret College and is involved in the Just Transition Partnership. And finally, we have Matthew Crichton, who again is involved in the Just Transition Partnership. He works for Friends of the Earth, but is mainly involved in the Just Transition Partnership here in this context here. Okay, so without further ado, we'll finish, I should say, we'll finish just before 2 o'clock. So about 5:02 is the plan. So hopefully that will work. So without further ado, let me pass over to Vicky, who will speak for around 5 minutes. Then we'll move on to Lena. So thank you, Vicky. Thanks for coming.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Carlo, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this event. I think it's notable that this event is taking place on Earth Day, and I, like probably many of you, have received a great number of greenwashing emails from different corporations and organisations today, especially those trying to sell me something. So where last week they might have been trying to sell me something that wasn't remotely environmentally friendly, this week they're trying to sell me a particular line, particular brand of cleaning products or whatever it is. And I think that this is part of the problem. This greenwashing we also receive from our employers, as well as from those corporations trying to sell things to us. And there's this context of making a recognition, I suppose, of the issues that we face, the very real issues around the climate emergency that has been declared by increasing numbers of employers, councils, governments, but the lack of actually doing the work to embed meaningful structural changes and programs of change that will build us a better future. So we're here today talking about this from a trade union perspective against this context of greenwashing, while also facing the challenge ourselves, I think, of making sure that the work that we do as unions is meaningful, does get deeply into the issues and robustly challenges those who are in charge of our nations and countries and regions, and those who are in charge of us in terms of employment relationships, and reminds them that if we don't work together and if we don't tackle the extremely urgent climate emergency, we won't have a world left to function within. So I'm going to try to talk a little bit about how UCU is tackling embedding climate justice and the fight for a just transition into our bargaining objectives to secure the future that we want for our planet and justice for climate and workers. And I'm going to try to link this a little bit up to a recent report that has come out, which counters any notion that there is an either or between structural change and individual changes, that actually a proper just transition, a real structural change, will make it affordable and accessible for all of us to feel that we can make a difference in our everyday lives. And in fact, that's the only sustainable way forward. So I think we do have to make it real. I think we have to recognise that there are barriers and issues for ordinary people, ordinary workers, in terms of the difference that they feel they can make when they're trapped within an economy which is anything other than just. And that is why, and I'm really excited that we're going to be hearing more about the just transition soon, and I'm really pleased that UCU has been so supportive of this. But it really matters that it is embedded in that way, and it's in every level of everything that we do as unions, because there is no question that we need urgently, we're overdue the need for an affordable, low carbon infrastructure that will make it possible for us all to make a difference. And that also has the potential to really fire up a just transition to a genuinely greener economy. So UCU has a number of initiatives, and we have long had policy, and we've had a really good tradition, I think, of making policy around climate change and the climate emergency. It includes, in 2019 at the TUC, we moved a composite motion calling for a 30-minute stoppage or climate action as part of the global climate school strike. Very importantly, connecting industry with students in education and young people. Activists in our branches have lobbied universities and colleges to allow their staff to support that, and also on making meaningful change. And we've seen a number of our employers, increasing numbers of our employers, being pressured into declaring a climate emergency, into going on record and saying there is a problem. But we have a context here of hypocrisy, and this is why it's so important that we embed the work that we do on the climate into our bargaining objectives, that we have green reps, that we have environmental reps, that our own branches integrate the work that we do in this area with everything else that we do, that it's never a bolt-on. It is always absolutely part of everything that we do. Because we're in this hypocritical context where, for example, many universities, often as a direct result of union members working together with students and people in the local communities, have declared a climate emergency, while quietly ignoring any criticisms that their global strategies actually are often incompatible with these statements on climate emergency and climate change. And this includes recent examples of chartering or even contemplating chartering flights for international students to come to the UK during a global pandemic when they should have been teaching exclusively online. It does not fill us with confidence in terms of pandemic management or commitment to climate change that this was the way that they were going. And it also illustrates neatly a crisis of congruence that we have, or perhaps that would be better expressed as a crisis of incongruence, where we have universities with many researchers and many areas of research active in fields related to climate justice, where these researchers have been sounding the alarm for a very long time, and yet their concerns are ignored or brushed aside until they're useful to be brought into the public sphere when that university, or I think this applies to lots of industries actually, want to kind of display their credentials. So we know that to have a practical and real impact, our support for action on climate change as a union has to be couched in a consciousness that it will be easier for some workers in our sector and other sectors to take different levels of action, because we don't live in a just society. And the challenge of a just transition is to make sure that it really is just and it doesn't become another area of greenwashing. It is incumbent on every union to prioritise finding and campaigning for ways to ensure that we do our bit across all sectors, because managements and bosses need to be held accountable everywhere and not let off the hook, not allowed to get away with using elements of our work for greenwashing and ignoring it when it is convenient to them. So we need to shift the focus away from the marketised squeeze on workers, which is designed to extract the profit for the few. The many deserve fair and just working lives in a decarbonised economy, with governments and institutions who take seriously the need to fight for the planet's survival. So this is why we are committed to a true mission for climate justice that incorporates social justice and never divorces the two, to remember that there is an unequal impact of the climate emergency on marginalised people, and that they have to be absolutely brought into all of our efforts in campaigning for a just transition. So I'm not going to talk very much more. I know that others are going to talk about the role of education and pick it up from there, but I just wanted to underline this union's commitment to the just transition, to making sure that we have extracted meaningful efforts from our employers and from our governments. Thank you.
Thanks, Vicky. Thanks. That was really helpful. It was a starter for us. Okay, if I can introduce Lena. Lena's
Thank you, and hello, colleagues. So as Carlo mentioned, I'll be, by the time that COP26 comes in the autumn, I will have replaced Carlo as the President of the Union in Scotland. And I'm very conscious then of the responsibility both I personally and UCU as a whole, our union, more generally faces in joining with many other voices demanding real and urgent action on climate justice from the world's leaders in Glasgow in November. Words are not enough. We've had words for a long time, as Vicky says. We need action now, and we needed action yesterday, actually, because it is an emergency, and we need to tackle it. So we're hearing today from other speakers who are detailing UCU's work on climate justice and sustainability, and on the work specifically on the Just Transition Partnership, which UCU is very proud to be part of. I want to speak briefly about some of the aspects that UCU is calling for around COP26 and climate change. They're detailed more fully in two pieces of work that UCU Scotland have produced recently, a manifesto that we produced for the Scottish Parliament elections, and also a longer alternative vision for higher education in Scotland, which you can both find on the web link that is on the screen now, ucu.org.uk/Scotland. I'd encourage you to have a look. We have many other items on there as well as the climate emergency and sustainability. Now, universities have a key role in Scotland, meeting sustainability targets and addressing the climate emergency. We are the biggest union in higher education, and we have an important role in this. And I'm glad to say that following votes passed at our recent Congress, we'll be looking to produce materials for our branches on COP26 and on climate change. And we'll be encouraging our members to produce, to put pressure on their institutions to take action in various ways. We're also asking them to incorporate climate justice and sustainability into their teaching. And we'll also try to bring back the successful teach outs that we did during the recent strike action to campuses during COP26 in order to kind of spread awareness of sustainability and the need for the world's leaders to agree action and urgent action. Now, Vicky mentioned as well the school strike in 2019, the youth climate strike, and I'm very proud that UCU was part of this, and personally I was there as well, waving the UCU Edinburgh banner, and it was really, really fantastic to see so many people and so many young people along with my colleagues and activists. There is already a huge activism on campuses around environmental issues, and by encouraging and pushing students to demand more, we're in a very strong position as a union to support and encourage environmental activism to drive change. Individual institutions and the principals and leadership teams, however, we need to actually ask them to start earning their big money salaries by being proactive and being bold in what they are doing. They can start by curtailing their university's own carbon footprints. Just think of the size of our campuses, not just in the UK and Scotland, but also the campuses abroad. As well as reducing their own carbon use, universities are also uniquely in the position of being pivotal as the creators of research into climate change and the move to a zero carbon economy. And UCU is very active in defending the academic freedom of members who sometimes, whose research sometimes is not as comfortable as the carbon industry would like. We've seen some leadership from the sector, with a small number of universities declaring a climate emergency. So Glasgow University is one of these institutions. This is not enough. In any event, it's a good thing to issue a press release when you're seeking good publicity and you're under the spotlight. However, it's another thing to do the detailed planning and hard work of actually addressing your own behavior and practices as an institution. We need deeds and not words. As a trade union, we are serious about making sure that the road to a zero carbon economy doesn't harm working people or leave them behind. So you'll hear more from the other speakers about Just Transition Partnership. We want our universities to join with the campus trade unions and NUS in a collective sector-wide demand for a sustainable future. So we have a few points that we're specifically calling for the higher education sector to commit to. First of all, declare a climate emergency, as some universities already have done. Secondly, pledge net zero emissions in higher education by 2030. Transition from fossil fuels in line with just transition principles of decent, fair, and high-value work which does not negatively affect the current workforce. Agree to establishing institution-wide steering groups involving management, students, and unions in order to review and change strategy. Embed sustainable development goals into education and research, teaching, and all the organizational parts of the university. Lobbying government, collaborating with partners in the locality and globally to make progress on climate change, and also, as I mentioned earlier, defending the academic freedom of these fantastic researchers who are working on the climate emergency and sustainability. It's a long list. It's a very long list, but it is a critical one if we want to play our part in meeting the challenges we're facing head on. COP26 gives us, as trade unionists, the chance to join with civic organizations and activists in Scotland and across the world to raise these issues when the world's media will be uniquely focused on climate change as an issue. And I promise that as UCU, we will do our absolute best to make COP26 result in a real change. That's me. Thank you.
Thanks, Lena. Thanks, that's really helpful. Okay, our next speaker is Eirik. Eirik's at Queen Margaret College, University in Edinburgh. He's the UCU Scotland rep on the Just Transition Partnership and has been very involved in climate change activities for a number of years. So Eirik, do you want to introduce yourself and
Thanks very much, Carlo. Yes, as Carlo says, I've been representing UCU Scotland on the Just Transition Partnership. You've heard from other speakers that UCU has a long track record of supporting action on climate justice and for a just transition, and because of that, UCU Scotland was very keen to get involved with the Just Transition Partnership when it was initially set up by the Scottish TUC and Friends of the Earth Scotland, and invited other individual unions to join it. Indeed, UCU Scotland held a Just Transition seminar a few years ago, before the partnership had got going, in Robert Gordon University in collaboration with Aberdeen TUC. It's interesting that the seminar was held in the Sir Ian Wood building of Robert Gordon's University. Sir Ian Wood was the founder and chief executive of the Wood Group, an oil and gas logistics company. And it demonstrated very clearly that it is not just offshore workers or workers directly employed in the fossil fuel industry that are dependent on these industries for their jobs and need to have a just transition away from the fossil fuel industry, whilst maintaining decent jobs, job security, and unionized jobs. I was also during the strike that UCU conducted into the pension strike a few years ago, and there were several student occupations, and I spoke to the student occupation at Edinburgh University, and the students there were telling me about how much influence the fossil fuel industry has in their departments, in their particularly science subjects. The fossil fuel industry regards, the companies regard universities as a place where they can advertise, where they can recruit, and where they can promote propaganda that says that they are going to be part of the solution to tackling climate change. Just transition, the concept, is the trade union movement's contribution to the resolution of the climate emergency. It's been in existence for several decades and is very clear that the trade union movement has regarded itself as being at the forefront of finding a way to move away from a fossil dependent economy whilst maintaining jobs, whilst protecting unionized jobs and protecting terms and conditions. Unfortunately, as just transition has become a little bit more popular, it has also become diluted. We're coming across the phrase just transition in many different places, in some places where trade unions are not even mentioned, or the workforce is not even mentioned. But at its heart, the just transition is about building alliances between trade unions and environmental groups. Groups which have often been portrayed as being antagonistic, the false jobs versus environment dilemma or conflict, whereas in fact the workforces and the environmental interests have a common enemy in the production system which is making profit out of the exploitation of both our labor and the environment. In the Just Transition Partnership, we were somewhat disappointed when the Just Transition Commission was set up, that trade unions and environmental groups were both in a minority of the commissioners. We regarded that a central plank of Just Transition is that it is an alliance between the trade unions, the environmentalists, and the communities that are most directly affected. And that is a basis of Just Transition. Whilst those who have a vested interest in maintaining their profits out of fossil fuels will have to be involved in the implementation of a just transition, we can't trust them to be part of defining what a just transition is. Nonetheless, there have been some good outcomes from the Just Transition Commission report. It's moving in the right direction, even if it's not with the urgency required. And it does recognize the important role that education must play in that transition. And I just want to make a couple of points about the role of education in the just transition. First of all, workers who are exiting from the fossil fuel economy can be an asset to education. These workers have tremendous skills, they have tremendous expertise, both as workers and also through trade union organizing. And their expertise is going to be essential in that transition. And educational institutions, such as universities, need to recognize that, need to bring such people into employment as educators. And the second thing to say is that jobs in the green economy, or green jobs, include the public sector workers and public service workers, the university teachers included in that. Not all green jobs are going to be in renewables and retrofitting. We will need more university lecturers. We will need more university librarians. We will need more university administrators, as well as school teachers, nurses, social workers, etc. These are all green jobs, and they have a central place in the just transition. Thank you.
Thanks, Ari. Thanks very much for all of that. Okay, our final speaker before we break into some discussion is Matthew Crichton, who's again involved in the Just Transition Partnership, works for Friends of the Earth, but here is mainly focusing on the Just Transition Partnership. So Matthew, welcome to this discussion, and go ahead. You've got 5 or so minutes to introduce yourself. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Carlo, and thank you to UCU for the invitation to speak here. I'm the secretary of the Just Transition Partnership. As Eirik said, it was set up by the Scottish Trade Union Congress and Friends of the Earth Scotland in 2016. Scotland is often said to be leading in some of these things, and often that's exaggeration. But actually, I think in this respect, this is a fairly unique thing to have a partnership between trade unions and environmental organisations. And you know that in those years, we've been learning from each other. And what we've done in that period, amongst other things, is frame a vision of just transition, which isn't just about the economy. It's not just about making the change happen in ways that protect workers' living standards. It's making sure social inclusion is part of the idea of just transition as well. So not just no one left behind, but something for everyone in this. And also this message that there will be no transition unless it is just. Unless we take people with us and have the transition is popular, we will not break down the barriers which we need to do to protect our planet. So looking at the context of the COP, the rhetoric from our governments is indeed world-beating. They are claiming leadership in relation to just transition. The action is much weaker. And if you only have to look at the question of jobs, and the STUC, I don't have to do much of this myself because the STUC has been in the forefront of pointing out both the broken promises about renewable jobs, jobs in the renewable industry, but also the enormous potential in a properly managed transition in the report they've just published, Green Jobs in Scotland. The other thing is that in the plans for climate change, not only do we not see any targets on job creation, we don't see any targets on social inclusion. If they're serious about just transition, they will be written into the climate change plan, and they haven't been. And that climate change plan, by the way, is barely adequate in its own terms for meeting the targets. Very quick word on the Just Transition Commission. It's very much in the same mould. Certainly there are some good words there, and there are some things we want the Scottish Government to do, but it's not a sufficient guide for the reasons that Eirik has said. So going back to the COP and the framing around that, obviously we should be mobilising trade union members to press for just transition and climate justice at the UN and global level, and that's vital because we're not alone on this planet. But also it's an opportunity to press for action from our own governments. And just if you're thinking about the question of where does just transition feature in the COP talks, in the UN climate talks, it doesn't jump out. And the reason is it's all in the plans that national governments are bringing to this. So if we need to raise these issues, we need to raise them with our governments and say, let's have a look at your plans. Are they plans for a just transition? I'll let you into a secret. That's not happening so far in the UK's one. So that's where we'll see the main issue. I just want to move on from that to a specific aspect which is very relevant to UCU members, which is the question of skills and training around the just transition, particularly in both higher education and further education, but also if there are anyone from PCS, DWP workers as well. It's very easy to see that there will be big opportunities for and demands on the training and education systems in a just transition. But it's important to emphasize three things. Firstly, that it isn't just an opportunity, it is that actually the capacities of the skills and education systems are entirely central to a just transition. We obviously need to generate lots of skills and the right labour force very quickly, and that'll require work for both existing workers, as Eirik has mentioned, and new entrants. But also, if we have an aspiration that the just transition will be transformative and bring social inclusion in its wake, the question of routes into good work for people who otherwise might be excluded from those kind of jobs, questions of equity around gender, race and class in the labour market and around geography, that is what education and training schemes, FE and HE, know how to do. We can do it. If we talk about the education and training system of Scotland, it can do it, but it can't do it on its own. And that's my second point. The skills system is capable of delivering, but it needs clarity, certainty, and investment from government and from the top. The Just Transition Partnership has been clear that the just transition has to be planned and led by government, calling for a national just transition plan, and not left to market mechanisms under some broad kind of exhortation from the top. So we said in our comments on the Climate Emergency Skills Action Plan that the skills plan should fit into a just transition plan and not vice versa. What we often find is that governments look around for things they can say they're doing, and they ask the skills sector and the education sector to come up with a plan. But actually what should be happening is that that sector should be given the certainty and clarity that it needs to plan ahead. Now, the last point is that this is about a just transition for workers in that sector as well, as Eirik has said. It's about having a clear plan with sufficient investment, which can provide the certainty needed, both by institutions, by learners, and by the employers whose role is important, and by the way, should be mandated in any funding support as well. In turn, this provides the basis for providing secure employment in the sector and a reduction in casualisation. I'll just end on a very quick memory of my own. In the 1980s, I took part in a strike of a day strike in Leeds City Council of workers on the YT schemes and the yacht schemes back in the day, and that was a strike against casualisation and against short-term contract, because the tasks and jobs which people do in the sector are really important. They're not going to go away, and as you know better than I do in the UCU, the grounds for making jobs permanent are very, very strong, but they will be very much clearer if we get a just transition plan and certainty around the investment and the expectations of our institutions. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. Look forward to the conversation.
Okay, thanks, Matthew. Thanks to everyone who's contributed so far. What I'm planning on here is not a Q&A per se, but just to raise some areas of discussion, and then leave it open to the panelists to contribute. So the first one I think is worth starting with is really the role of trade unions in this, because it seems to me that issues around jobs and issues around employment within a decarbonised economy is central to this. And trade unions clearly have a huge role to play. So really the first thing I want to start with is where Matthew left off, really, and Eirik was talking about as well. And that is, what is the role of trade unions in the climate change campaign? What are the barriers that we're facing in terms of pushing for green changes in our sector, particularly in UCU, but wider than that? And how might we start to overcome some of those barriers? So give Matthew a few moments to get his breath, I think. So should we start with Vicky and then work back down again, if that's okay? Or if others want to jump in, feel free to.
Okay, thanks, Carlo. I mean, that's a big question. It's not a small question. And I think the main thing that we need to remember is that in order to have an effect as unions, we need to be working with each other, but we also need to be reflecting on how we operate as unions. I mean, we are organisations ourselves. We have to make sure that we are embedding the principles that we're calling on others to model ourselves. And I think that for UCU as an education union, we particularly know that we have to play an important role in retraining and reskilling of the workforce for a greener economy. But that has to go beyond a concept of something that's done to workers, because that makes it feel kind of punitive somehow. It has to go beyond that. We all have to feel part of this. We all have to feel connected in educating ourselves in the process of a just transition. And obviously there is also a role there for research, and how research into very technical and specialized fields can drive green innovation and change. How, for example, we might repurpose industrial plants and production, but also we need to make sure that that kind of research is co-created with communities. It cannot be a top-down answer. We have to create an atmosphere of collaboration and democracy, and that is far more likely to foster a passion amongst all of us for creating a wholesale shift to a green and fair economy. And that will work for all of us. That will work for our planet as well. And I think key to that, going back to what several speakers have talked about, is ensuring that ordinary workers, especially the most vulnerable, the most marginalised, the most precariously employed, are not collateral damage to deindustrialization, because I think that's where a lot of fear comes from about what a just transition might mean.
Okay, Lena, do you want to contribute to that? Add to it?
Yes, sure. I mean, I think more broadly, I was thinking trade unions, of course, have a vital role representing workers and speaking as the voice of workers. But also in any democracy, trade unions are central to making sure that politicians, institutions, organizations actually do what they're saying that they're supposed to do. So obviously we will keep on lobbying government and Scottish government and make sure that they are keeping to their word, and also our employers. And I think we work together with students on this issue, and because our employers, some of our institutions they have more buildings and more staff than any other employer locally. If you look at a university like Edinburgh University or Glasgow University, it's huge. So accepting the local authority and the health service, that is the biggest employer, and that is the, you can imagine a change that we could do there in terms of sustainability and kind of carbon footprints and so on. So I would say more widely, representing members across sectors, we are needed in a democracy to keep pushing not just our employers but also politicians to make sure that action happens on this.
Thanks, Lena. And Eirik, where you go?
What can trade unions do? Number one, put just transition on the collective bargaining agenda. It's a routine. It should be just transition plans should be what we should be talking to our employers and to our employers' organizations about routinely. Secondly, trade unions can work with allies. The environmental movement should be seen as our allies. We should be supporting their struggles, and we hope and we are seeing examples of environmentalists supporting our struggles. So that is another thing that trade unions can do. Invest in our own education. Make sure that our green reps, our sustainability reps, are adequately trained, are adequately educated, know what just transition is about and the role that they can play. Just an aside here, when we did some work in my own branch, it was quite clear that many of our members knew more about the climate emergency from their children who had been walking out of school, or even worse, they knew more about the climate emergency from David Attenborough than they knew from the union. Now, our union does provide good education, but it needs to be rolled out more. There needs to be more of it. And the fourth thing is, we're always talking about we need more funding for higher education in the UCU, and that's absolutely right. And the current the Climate Emergency Skills Action Plan suggests that there won't be more money, but we have to do more work for the transition. We need to say, well, look, if we're going to be providing the work, we need more money. It's an opportunity for us to say there needs to be more money. And all the research demonstrates that where there's been any kind of transition, for example, in the Ruhr Valley in Germany, away from coal, it started with a big investment in tertiary education. It wouldn't have happened without that. So those are 4 areas.
Great, thanks, Eirik. And Matthew, do you want to go next?
Yeah, quickly, yeah. I mean, as always, Eirik has said most of what I would say already. So thank you, Eirik. I just should say that, I mean, I came to these issues as an activist in my own union, Unison. And so I just sort of think back to that. One of the things that's really important in just transition and tackling climate change is that on the one hand, we engage the people who are affected, i.e. the workers, the workforce affected, and we learn from them. And the key challenge here for a trade union is to balance future and immediate needs of the workforce and to articulate that idea of a just transition so that, as I said before, everybody feels they've got a stake in making it happen. And I think that's a really important thing. I just talked very quickly about this stuff that Eirik's referred to, that relationship between trade unions and I like to say the rest of the climate change movement, because it's great to know that trade unions are part of that movement, and it's been a process, and we've been driving it collectively and individually, and that's a, you know, it's an excellent part of the contribution. Not only is speaking for people directly affected, it's actually about how you make change happen. And you know, if we look at what the strengths of the trade union movement is, and what the strengths of the environmental movement, we can see that the trade unions basically kind of get how to make change happen and how the economy works in a way which maybe some of us in the environmental movement haven't really focused very much attention on. So I think it's, you know, that's why I'm deeply enthusiastic about the Just Transition Partnership, because it's that place where we learn from each other and we build strength that way. Because it, just to say it again, only a strong global and national and local movement will make sure that we protect ourselves and our planet.
Thanks, Matthew. And I think, I mean, one of the reasons I asked that question is to many trade unions, it's kind of basic bread and butter ideas of trade unionism, that you show solidarity, that you demonstrate unity, but it's not automatic. It's, you know, that's a concept that comes through an understanding of community, of solidarity between ourselves, and recognizing differences, but also supporting one another when we fight. And that really leads me on to my next question, really, which is about equality in this, because often the climate change debate is treated or presented as trade-offs between one group of winners and one group of losers. And I think one of the things that we say as trade unionists is that we all rise together, and our strength comes from our unity, not from divergence. And in particular, the question I really want to ask about is about equality, particularly anti-racism and wider development, because of course the victims, those who will suffer most from climate change, are going to be in the developing world, not in the developed world. So if I can ask the next question, which is really about equality, anti-racism and its role in climate change. And Lena, do you want to kick off that, and we'll kind of rotate it a little bit?
I mean, absolutely, sustainability and the climate emergency is an equality issue as well. It is a global issue. It's an anti-racist issue, I would say. The climate emergency, we call it an emergency because it is already happening. It has been happening for a long time. It's only in recent years that, you know, they've started kind of building walls in Florida to keep out the seawater. But in the global south, this has been happening for a long time. There are already climate refugees and have been so for decades. This is not new. Sadly, of course, that's the time when we listen to people is sadly when they are usually in the global north, in places of power and privilege. So the climate emergency is racialized, I would say, and it definitely has imperialist structures, kind of neo-colonial structures, and quite often we could actually do with learning from many other countries. There are various countries, several African countries and other countries in the global south who already are in just transition projects that we could learn from. So, Vicky, do you have anything more to say on this?
I was thinking about how relevant what we've been discussing here is to the issue of actually what I think there was a recent report from the Cambridge Sustainability Commission talking about the contribution, if you like, it's the wrong word really, of the polluter elite. And some of the stuff that came out of that report highlights how inequality is so embedded in every aspect of society that of course it is more difficult for people who are from who are in marginalized communities to have access to participating in greener technologies. I mean, on very basic levels, you know, just not being able to afford to live in a different way, and how that is often instrumentalized somehow. I think, as Carlo was saying, you know, these things are pitted against each other, as if individuals not being able to make a difference because of the barriers to them, you know, being able to access different ways of living, are often used in a way that actually underlines the marginalization of those communities in the first place. So this report shows that between 1990 to 2015, nearly half of the growth of global emissions was due to the richest 10%, with the richest 5% alone contributing over 1/3. And that unless we actually have policymakers and policy implementers targeting that polluter elite to trigger that shift that we need to a more sustainable economy that supports more sustainable behaviour across the board, it will not be affordable for individuals to live in a different way. So you've got the double whammy of being blamed and also being at the sharp end of the climate emergency, exactly as you've been describing. And I think that the crisis with climate refugees and, you know, refugees who are also fleeing violence that may not be directly related to a climate related, you know, may not be a flood or something, but it will be still directly relevant to the climate emergency, because warfare is directly relevant to a climate emergency because of the way that the economy is working on that global scale. We have to take all of that seriously. The only way to take it seriously is to actually integrate how we're thinking about what a just transition would look like. It cannot be individuals pitted against structural level change. It cannot be, oh, well, over there, you know, people are having this, that, and the other. The birth rate is doing this. They're doing this. They're developing their economy in these ways. They're using these kinds of energy producing technologies. Therefore, let's not bother over here. It cannot be like that. And we have to get out of that rhetoric because it's a trap.
Okay, Eirik or Matthew, do you want to comment? Matthew, go ahead.
I'll come in.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I'll speak quickly about equality issues within a plan for a just transition, particularly in relation to the labour market. If you equate a just transition and the rapid pace of change we need, the large scale of investment we need, it's the same territory as a Green New Deal, which you'll be familiar with. If you look at the scale of change we need a lot more people working on these projects. So we need to ramp up the investment, and we need to bring people with us on that. What happens in our economy if you just first question is, how do you get that investment made? But if you just invest as you always have done, you end up replicating all the inequalities that exist already in our labour markets. So when you talk about a just transition at government level, or even within trade unions, and you are determined that when you bring this large scale investment into the economy, at the behest of the people or at the behest of government, if you're determined that that will increase inclusion or overcome disadvantages, you've got to work out how to do it. Right? You either replicate or you challenge in the labour market. So it's just a bit of work that I used to do, and I know full well that, for example, we know how to overcome disadvantages in the labour market, but we have to spend the money and make the plans to do that. Gender and racial bias in apprenticeship, for example. You can fix it, but you've got to plan to do it. Making sure people who've had a bad start in life have second chances. You've got to invest in those opportunities and make them available. Overcoming systematic disadvantage depends on, for example, putting conditions on the way in which you invest. If you're procuring, maybe, but also just determining that you will spend the money as a public sector in such a way that you create fair jobs, you overcome casualization, you make sure that people who are disadvantaged get an equal chance to enter good jobs. And you also think about where the jobs are created. We live in the territory of deindustrialization in the previous unfair just transition. Coal communities around the country are still depressed as a result of that. We need to create employment in those places. That can all be done if we plan it. And if we determine that the investment must be put in, and when we determine that, we determine the ways in which it's done. So it can be done, but you have to be clear. And honestly, government saying it will create a new inclusive Scotland or new inclusive UK without any specific plans, you've really got to look very carefully at what they're saying.
Great, thank you, Matthew. If I can move along quickly, and I'll ask Eirik to comment on this to start with, and then Lena, because I know Lena's got to go shortly. And that is, if we can finish up on discussion around COP26 and concretely, so what can trade unionists do? What is being planned, and what take-home message should activists on listening to this take away from here? So, Eirik, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll maybe just start with the kind of reference to the previous question and move on to this one, because it certainly is a case that there is a limited carbon budget that the atmosphere can absorb the waste stream of, and nearly all of that has been already used up by the rich world and the predominantly white world and the rich people in all parts of the world. So it's a simple question of justice to say that it's the rich countries and the rich class within these countries that need to cut carbon, and that's why in UCU we talk about zero carbon, not net zero carbon. And I know that there are differences within the trade union movement about that, but we've spent our carbon budget in Scotland. We need to get to zero carbon. Now, we don't know how to do it fully yet, but by working together as workers, organized through trade unions with allies in the other social movements, that's how we can move towards that. Talking of allies in the other social movements, this is how we can start to prepare for COP26. If there are people here who are members of unions that are not affiliated to the Just Transition Partnership, I would encourage them to do so. There's the COP26 coalition of social movements and trade unions and various other organizations, which has a trade union caucus, and the local trade union councils are also starting to mobilize towards COP26, in particular the Glasgow one, obviously, because that's where it is. So those are three areas that trade unionists can get involved in the mobilizations towards COP26.
Okay, Vicky, do you want to go next, and then Matthew? I think, Lainey, you've got to go. Matthew, you're fine. So Vicky, go ahead.
Thanks. I was just typing in a link that I hope that we can flash up to UCU's page on the Green New Deal as well. And this is, we've got something on the go where we're trying to bring together policies set by UCU and the NUS within a negotiating and bargaining framework. And I think it's a really good example of collaborative working, that it provides a model, if you like, for what people can do. Not only ahead of COP26, but also just in general. And I think that it's really important that despite, as Eirik was saying, there are differences across the movement in interpretation. And also, I think that speaks to what we were talking about before around the level of nervousness around what deindustrialization could do to different sectors. And that in itself is an argument for a genuinely just transition. We are working with other unions, and partly, for example, through the Trade Union Coordinating Group, we have a committee that is looking at how we can actually take action for the climate. And we're looking at principles like good green jobs, not greenwashed jobs, so that we're actually fighting for that meaningful change and really emphasizing the importance of training and education. And that is for all of us. That is for all of us as reps. It is for all of us who are in any way involved in community organising. And it is also in terms of trying to get that education out there in every place possible. It's about ensuring worker involvement, trade union involvement in the planning of that transition. It has to be done at a sectoral level. It has to be done collectively. It has to be done at a regional level as well. And absolutely integral to that is trade union recognition and workers' rights. And I think that's why it's so important that we do, as unions, embed the work that we're doing on climate justice into our bargaining agenda. I don't feel like we can say that enough times, because that is the only way that we will make sure that it's really embedded in those industrial relations with our employers and in all of our campaigning. And again, also going to just underline the importance of the public sector involvement. It's so important that we get back public ownership of our infrastructure. It will make such a difference. And I want to finish on the note of when I was looking up, what's happening ahead of COP26, the thing that kind of grabbed me the most was the BBC News Round programme, the children's TV news programme, has a link on it, especially there for children who are having nightmares about climate change. If our children, if our younger generation are having nightmares about climate change, and also in many cases know more about it than we do, then we absolutely have to pick up this baton and run so fast with it. We have so much to do. It is so important that we just cannot afford to stop. So if you do anything coming out of this meeting, please just find out what you don't already know. There is so many resources out there. There's some really good training courses online that are free. For example, through the Green Jobs Alliance have a free set of courses that you can do. Please educate yourself. Please look at what your union is doing. Look at what you think your union should be doing, and just get involved.
Thanks, Vicky. Thanks. That's really great. So I'll just wrap up here. I'd like to thank Rebecca for doing the sign language for us. Thank you very much. It's not easy, I can see by watching you. Thanks, everyone, to all our speakers. Lena's had to rush off because she's teaching, so that's why she couldn't stay too much to the very end. And I'd just like to reiterate one thing, that the more the union and its branches are involved in campaigning around climate change, we don't just fight over climate change, but we also build the union in this way. Bringing the fact that trade unions are part of the climate change debate and part of the campaigning is an eye-opener to lots of people in their local communities that aren't in trade unions or don't know about trade unions, and that can bring them into the fold of looking at trade unions for social change. So make sure your branch is involved, not just in your own campus and your own workplace around climate change, but in the local community. And COP26 provides us with a marvelous opportunity to do that and embed the trade unions in the climate change movement. So thanks everyone for listening. Thanks everyone for participating. And I think it's time to call it a day and give Rebecca a break. So thank you. Thanks.